Welcome back to Cheap Pop, everybody. This is Derek Kirby, joined as always by my friend Matt Carlin. We are talking Neon Genesis Evangelion. Today, we're specifically talking about episodes 9 and 10. It's not been very long since we last recorded, but I'm digging it. We were just talking about that. We've been cranking these out lately, but nothing wrong with getting a little ahead of the schedule for a change. Matt, what are you thinking now as you're watching these episodes? I know you were really high on the last couple episodes. I'm curious to get your thoughts with these two latest ones.
It's pretty hard to come down from episode 8, and 9 was a little bit slower, but it's fine. And then 10, I feel like we kind of picked back up on. So 8's probably still my favorite to date, but 10 kind of brought me back. So not on 8's level, but still good. Still very good.
Yeah. So episode 9, it feels almost like an extension to me of Asuka's introduction.
Yeah.
Because we see how she's in this episode is called Mind Matching Moment. And it's an extension essentially that we're seeing how she's adjusting now in school. So what we didn't really get a chance to mention at the end of the last episode, I think I maybe touched on it at the very end. The last thing you got last episode was just her introducing herself at school. For some reason, Toji and them are like horrified and in disbelief she's there. And it's like, well, you know, she's an Eva pilot. You know, Rei and Shinji, both Eva pilots, transferred into your school. Why would you not assume the same would be true of Asuka? So that I don't know about that, but we see almost a little bit of a creepy start. We see like, okay, all the boys at school are basically drooling over her. She's being photographed.
Is it creepy to photograph somebody while they're changing clothes in the locker room?
Like the girls' locker room.
Totally normal here. Just spying on some 14-year-old girls in the locker room, just like everyone does, right?
Yeah. I guess they're trying to say like, oh, it's not as bad when you realize the people taking the photos are 14-year-old boys. Like, it's still not good, but okay.
Is it the boys we established that are taking the photos? Because while I was watching that scene, you know, we kind of get the commentary from the boys, but I'm like, are they the ones taking these photos?
Yes.
Or
because
just making sure.
So we get all these photos, like, yeah, the locker room shot, her in like gym gear, you know, having to almost kind of sit in a way where she's kind of like blocking basically like the view of her crotch or whatever. Getting a drink from the water fountain.
Photo there for sure.
Yeah, all kinds of kind of suggested. They're candid photos. They're not like her posing or doing anything.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a creepy vibe. And then you see during the voiceover where Toji and Shinji's other friend are talking about you know, oh, all the boys are obsessed with her. You can tell the girls are kind of annoyed by the attention she's getting. But they're like, oh, the guys only like her because they can't see how ugly she is on the inside. And I'm like, it's kind of funny how quickly he's drawn just a hardline stance on like, she's the worst. Like, I feel like his is a little overreaction, even though she slapped him. I'm like, dude.
She did slap the shit out of him twice. So
true.
You know,
and the first one you could say wasn't really his fault. The second one was absolutely his fault.
Yeah.
But even still, but the reason I say like it's them is because you see him holding up the strip of the camera footage. So like, I think it's them taking the photos, and I got the indication that they're literally like selling photos to like the other boys.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing with her, and maybe I'm reading into it a little bit too much, but I think his whole dislike for her is trying to maybe comment a little bit on like how people act towards women. And really he is like typically always like, you know, talking about how they look and, you know, boobs and butt and all this stuff. And it's like the second he gets some like flack and he gets some girl that kind of like fights back, he's immediately like, oh, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
Almost like the interest comes from the lack of caring about how like much of an object women are to him. But the second anybody comes back, he's like, oh no, I'm not interested in somebody that like has, you know, boundaries that I don't want to like, you know, kind of back to that bubble thing. Is like he wants to be able to get right in that bubble, which he still is without her consent. But he doesn't like the fact that she is opposed to that.
Yeah. That's a fair point. That's interesting. Um, so we see she's opening her locker. It's just exploding basically with love letters and everything. And she could not care less. Not only does she stamp on them, she's like twisting her shoe, like, scraping it out. Like she's just like, could not care less about the affection. She didn't even care who the letters are from. She's just like, freaking idiots. Like she doesn't have time for this. All she cares about is being an Ava pilot, which is interesting. Like just how not typical she is, I guess, in many respects, not all respects, because we do see that she does have infatuation of different nature, but she just could not care less about the attention of these random no-name boys. And I think it's interesting too. She then approaches Ray and she's like, "Oh, you're the pilot of the prototype, right?" And Ray's like reading her book. Asuka's like blocking the sunlight, so Ray like moves the book. Asuka shifts to be back in the way of the sunlight, and then she's like, "Oh, we should be friends." And Ray's like, "Why?"
Why?
And she's like, "Because it'll go much easier for us if we are friends. Things will be easier if we are friends." And Ray, just being Ray, is just like, "I'll be your friend if I'm ordered to." And Asuka has no idea what to do with that. She's like, "You're a weird one." Like that. What am I supposed to say to that?
Very typical Ray response, though.
Oh.
It's like robotic to every sense of it.
Mm-hmm. And then you have like Shinji's friends kind of commenting in the background, like, "Oh, I guess one of the prerequisites for being an Ava pilot is being super weird." And they're kind of saying like, "Oh, well, Asuka's weird too." And I'm like, sort of, but she's more normal than either Shinji or Ray, I would say.
She's more outspoken for sure. She's definitely a bit of an odd duck, but like in a fun way.
Yeah.
Whereas the other two are like loner, kind of creepy way. She kind of is the other end of the spectrum. She's the more manic side of their depressive.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But we move then to an angel attack. This is Asuka's debut in Japan, and it goes comically bad. You can tell just like from the outset, this is not going to go well because they are not in agreement on anything. Asuka's just like, "Yeah, you stay out of my way. I'm going in." She goes in and tries to deliver a kill shot immediately. This angel does something no other angel has before. It splits in two. And so from what I gathered with this angel is it can split in two if you like sever it, but it still can only be destroyed once it's in one piece. So that's something that is kind of an interesting thing. It splits in two, and we basically hard cut to basically what would you even call this? Like, it's not a hearing, but it's like basically they're reviewing what went wrong. It's almost like an athlete after the game. Debriefing. It's almost like an athlete after the game watching the game tape back. Like, "All right, tell me where you effed up."
Because you effed up bad. Literally,
we see
feet in the air. Like, all of the Ava is underground with the exception of like its kneecap to its feet. Just embarrassing looking.
Yeah, Unit 1 is basically pile driven into the ocean. Asuka, meanwhile, I think they said it's like literally at 9:52, Unit 1 was dispatched by Angel whatever. 5 seconds later, Unit 2 was dispatched. It's like the same position, but she's at least in the mountainside. And I like her kind of quip when Shinji, because they're bickering still the whole time, like whose fault it was. Of course, it starts out with Asuka first, levying the first blow against Shinji, and Shinji's like, "You got taken out just the same way," and she's like, "Hardly. You look like you're drowning out there." And it's just like it's no different, but it is kind of funny how she's still like somehow trying to equate his situation as more embarrassing than hers. And
he's given her some like pushback on her bickering for the first time, though. Like before, he was just kind of putting up with her, and now he's like, "Okay, I'm sick of you talking like this. I'm gonna come back at you a little bit." So really, I mean, it's back to just like it's two children that don't really seem to like each other at first. But yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, and Futsuki, which is Gendo's right-hand man. He hadn't really had a whole lot. He's just kind of been there for a lot of this, but Gendo is not in this episode at all. And so he's essentially the one in charge here. of this whole thing. So he's talking about all of this at the debriefing, and he's asking them like, what is your number one objective? What is your objective here? Your top objective? And Asuka incorrectly says, to pilot the Ava. And he's like, no, to beat the Angels. Basically like, check your ego. Like, just do what defeats the Angels. Don't make this about you doing something to prove yourself. This is embarrassing. And we then cut to Misato, who's not at the debriefing because she's already dealing with just a mountain of paperwork, from like everything from like bills from the UN for the damage incurred, because they did incapacitate the Angel. They didn't destroy it, but they incapacitated it with an N2 mine, which is this huge explosion, levels a large part of the area. They say like, we're going to have to like remap that entire area of the city, basically. So it's a huge thing, but it does at least damage the Angel enough. It's going to have to go dormant for about, I think they say 6 days to recuperate and then continue its advance. And that's going to be a time that they have to figure out how to deal with its latest counter, because they've never seen an Angel that could split in two. And they realize like, we have to be able to have our pilots in perfect lockstep. And so we're going to have an answer to this. And the idea actually comes from Kaji, which we said Misato's previous history, whether you want to say boyfriend or whatever.
The scene before that with him coming on to Risuko.
Yeah.
And she's just like, she's playing into it.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, are they a couple now? And Misato is just outside, just pasted on the glass.
Yeah.
In just like the most hilarious way. And she's like, well, we have somebody watching us right now, so let's probably not do that. Yeah.
No, Ritsuko absolutely will play into that sometimes just to get a rise out of Misato. And I think Kaji's doing the same thing there. But I also kind of get the impression that like Kaji would have been okay with if Ritsuko had been like legitimately like reinforcing that. But he is also, I think, infatuated with Misato still.
Yeah. At least enough where he gains whatever advantage he's trying to get out of the situation, which I think that is very much his game, is like, I play the sexual aspect and it gets me somewhere I need to go, whether that's influence from you or you going along with my decision. So it seems like he's very much influencing others in that way. Just like, I think, there's probably other characters that are doing the same thing. Yeah,
definitely. So it's his idea for what they ultimately have to do. They're going to have Asuka move in. She moves in to Misato's apartment with Shinji. And it's funny because her boxes and crap is just everywhere. And she's under the assumption that Shinji's being kicked out so she can move in. And she's just like, oh, well, obviously Misato had to upgrade. I mean, yeah, it's the obvious thing, right?
Because I'm so much better than you.
Yeah. And Shinji, he's just horrified because not only is his room gone, all of his stuff is just in a box, like crammed in the corner, which is funny because it's like 2 boxes you were talking before about like no child cleans his room. Apparently he doesn't have anything to clean.
He doesn't have anything. Yeah. There's nothing there. She has every box DHL has ever handled in their history of being a company.
Yep. Yeah. It's obscene. It's like every square inch of the apartment is stacked to the ceiling basically with stuff. And she's like, most of my stuff doesn't even fit in here. How do people live? Like, where were you before this? Like even before, like, because you were in Japan before today. So where was all your stuff then? Was it en route? Maybe, I don't know. But Misato comes in and basically tells them like, no, we're all living together now. And you two are going to have to get on the same page and synchronize. So we're going to play this music and you're going to learn how to move basically in perfect unison to this beat. Basically, you're going to go through every coordinating step of your next week getting into that rhythm with each other, because you have to move and strike as one when you fight the Angel when the time comes, or else we're going to lose basically. So they're
getting ready for essentially like a dance routine together.
Yep. And that's a very apropos way of putting it, because we cut to, they've been gone for 3 days. Shinji's classmates are coming over to his house. They're like, man, 3 days is a long time to be out. He must not be sick. Like, what's going on? And they run into the class rep who's going to check on Asuka. And Asuka and Shinji open the door, And I don't know what the hell they're wearing. It's very much another one of these situations where it looks more like a kind of feminine outfit that they have Shinji
it's very feminine. Looks like 80s like
80s workout gear.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because that would probably have then been Misato's, I guess. But they're in like matching, basically spandex suits with like a very loose, stretched out t-shirt all over the top. And like they have their headphones on that even kind of match. And it's funny because like his classmates are like laughing like, oh my God, it's so much worse than we thought. What is this? And their speech is in perfect rhythm. Like you think like, oh, this must be going really well because they're saying the exact same thing with the same inflection in perfect unison. But then we see when they're cutting to basically all the kids are over for dinner, they're trying to like continue practicing on this, like we said, dance routine, like DDR style game. And they are doing terribly.
Horrible. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're like, that was very different from the impression when they opened the door, I guess. Doesn't matter if Misato made them dress alike and try and do all this to get on the same page. It's clearly not going well.
Well, and what I got from that too is like when they're in their just very like natural state and they finally let their guard down around each other.
Yeah.
They're in sync. Just like they were in the Ava when they like came together and decided to like, okay, let's stop bickering. And then it's easy for them. But when they try, there's so much opposition from both of them that they just make a mess of it.
One might say that it's almost as if it's when they let their AT fields down that they actually are in unison. trying to draw it back a little bit. But yeah, so Asuka is, of course, blaming Shinji for everything. She's like, I can't work with him. This is ridiculous. This is stupid. This isn't going to work. And Misato's like, what do you want to do? Do you want to quit? And Asuka's like, if I quit, there's no one else to replace me. And this is one of those moments where Misato is like, I get Asuka needs to be humbled a little bit, but she's kind of a bitch in how she goes about it. Like she kind of pushes too far.
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, Rei, go in there. Yeah, because Rei also showed up when they were at the door. I forgot to mention.
It's okay. She's so quiet. You barely notice her until
you forget about her until that moment when Misato sends her in. You're like, oh yeah, Rei. So Rei goes in, puts on Asuka's headphones, and Asuka's already just seeing like that Rei is being called in. She's already kind of like, oh shit. Like she already kind of knows like Misato's way too confident sending her in here like this. Maybe she can actually do it. And immediately she's in perfect lockstep with Shinji. They haven't even practiced. They've done nothing. And Asuka is just immediately embarrassed. And for whatever reason, she gets mad at Shinji. And like Asuka's like, well, screw this, and storms off because, I went just a tick ahead of what I meant to. As they're in lockstep and Asuka's kind of like beside herself, like can't believe what she's seeing. Misato out loud just goes like, maybe we should just replace Asuka with Rei. That would probably be better. And it's just like, my God, you already humbled her. You didn't have to like twist the knife and then pour the salt on it afterwards. So Asuka, beside herself, pissed off, just yells, screw this, and storms off. Then the class rep gets mad at Shinji and is like, you just made a girl cry. Go after her. Take responsibility. I'm like, what did Shinji do? He's had headphones on this whole time. He wasn't. Yeah, he wasn't even listening to the conversation. Like, this is Misato who should be doing that. But I guess maybe she didn't feel comfortable blaming an adult, so she just, by extension, was like, Shinji, you do it. But yeah, Shinji goes off, and Asuka like does not want to hear it. Like the second he shows up, she basically knows why he's there, and she's like, save it. I don't even want to hear it. I'm a little confused on this next part. We cut to, I'm guessing the next morning or something. Like they're on a rooftop or something, as I remember it. Is that how you remember it? Their conversation?
Which part are we talking about here?
Basically, when Asuka's like, you know what? They've insulted me. Like they've hurt my pride. I'm going to prove them wrong. Screw them. I'm going to, shove it in their face. Basically, we're gonna work our ass off these next few days, and we're going to do this thing. Like. It's kind of her resilience, but again, it's like leaning into her own sort of toxic traits as opposed to learning a lesson, which ultimately doesn't matter as much as like, well, is the important thing that you're going to do it with the job and do it right now? Cool. So they do that. They go through and we get a montage of them in perfect sync now, everything from brushing their teeth to the dancing game. And during this week, apparently, they've all been sleeping on the living room floor, basically all, side by side, essentially, in their own beddings and everything. But the night before the mission, we learned that Misato is working late, which as soon as it comes up, I was like, oh, yeah, is she? Yeah. And Asuka's
working late.
Yeah, she's working something. And Asuka's like, oh, great, we have the apartment all to ourselves. And you're like, what are you thinking? But then she just snatches up her bedding and goes to the other room and immediately like throws the door back open to basically tell Shinji, like, you're staying out here. But like you have like the basically like cleavage shot because she like, I guess, set the bedding down on the ground and was still like on her hands and knees, swings the sliding door open and her shirt's just like hanging open. And Shinji's like,
Yeah, any chance they can show you that she has boobs or a butt, they're doing it.
Yes.
They're like, hey, don't forget, she's super hot, right?
Mm-hmm. And like in episode 1, when you mentioned like, oh, Asuka, or you said like, oh, Misato is the hot girl. I'm like, Misato is the hot girl, but what you don't know is that there are multiple, and there are ones that will be shown more for ridiculous whatever reasons. They will find excuses even in scenes that don't tonally make sense to show you like a cleavage shot or a butt shot or some sort of camera placement that you're like, what, why? But middle of the night.
It's Japanese anime.
Yeah.
It's not going to change. That's just the norm.
Yeah. And so middle of the night, Asuka, half asleep, gets up to go to the bathroom. Shinji is still awake listening to music, but the second he hears the door, he basically pretends to be asleep. And I guess because she's half awake after she goes to the bathroom, she comes back and just plops down basically on the bedding next to him, forgetting, I guess, that her bedding is in her room. Or maybe she's not forgetting. I don't know. It's never quite clear. But again, her boobs basically right in his face. So when he finally opens his eyes, he's like, because they're just right there. And he's doesn't even know how to do it. I like that he like freaks out and hits the recorder and it's just like fast forwarding or whatever. It's just like, that's probably a good equivalent for what his thoughts are like right now. But they go, the thing races through. He's staring at her mouth. He's like, hormones.
I love how he's just like, this seems like the right moment to kiss her. Yeah. And I'm like, she is asleep right now.
Yeah.
Now, granted, she's looking hot. I get it. But like, she is supposedly passed out.
Yep. Yeah. He inches to the point where he's like a breath away from kissing her. Her eyes well with tears, and apparently she mutters "mommy" under her breath, which if there's a mood killer there, I'll grant you that's probably it. And then we cut to him. He's like,
maybe for you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't need to get into that. But he's slunked off to like the corner of the room. He's basically just like blue balls over there, just all like bundled up in the blanket and just like, you're as much of a child as I am. Just doesn't know what to do, and he's just like hidden himself away.
This whole scene felt like after I watched it, I was like, is this happening? Is he dreaming this? Because like we shifted from them being next to each other to him being like in his little blanket, which we get later in the episode, we realize all of this was happening, but it felt like a little bit disconnected to the point where I was like, was Shinji just like dreaming that she was next to him this whole time?
Yeah.
But he was.
Yeah. Right. Then meanwhile, we'll wrap this one up here quick, but I know Misato elsewhere meets up with Ritsuko. Now, this is after the elevator scene we already had with her and Kaji, right? That happened earlier in the episode. I don't think we mentioned it, where they're in the Nerve HQ on the elevator, and he basically like forces himself on her for a kiss. She resists at first, but gives in. And basically just like, oh, you can't do that. I'm not your girlfriend anymore.
She's like grinding up on his leg or something.
Yeah.
I was like, what are we doing here?
Yeah. So I think that was early in the episode, but I think we skipped over it. But Misato is the night before, when all that stuff with Shinji and Asuka's going on, she's basically drinking coffee and talking with Ritsuko, and they're talking a little bit about that history. And it's almost like a methinks thou dost protest too much when Ritsuko's asking her about like Kaji, like, oh yeah, you're totally still into it. And she's like, it doesn't matter if I am, blah, blah, blah. Like, she just doesn't want anything to do with it. She doesn't want to get into that whole thing. But Ritsuko's kind of like, it's pretty obvious that you're still into it. And maybe you just need to kind of drop the preconceptions about it. But that's what Misato was doing while Shinji and Asuka were having their moment. We then cut to the day of the battle, and the Angels on the move. They say that only 26% of they're talking about like the power, I think, or the artillery, basically the infrastructure is like 26% because they had so much damage inflicted from the previous one that they only have like 1 minute and 9 seconds on the power once they disconnect. So we've talked before, like, oh, they had 5 minutes when they disconnected from their auxiliary power. They got 1 minute 9 seconds here. So they're moving in perfect sync. You have the music playing and they're in perfect rhythm. The Angel splits in two. They're continuing to kick its ass. And they basically both like flying kick it to the face to death. And you get this huge crater and explosion. Dust clears. Unit 2 and 1 are just sprawled out on top of each other. Like they wiped out basically on the finishing move, but they got the job done. Everyone at Nerve is like, oh, this is so embarrassing. Not again. And I get it, but at the same time, it's like, well, you won. That's what really matters.
Yeah, you did win.
It's the friendships we made along the way. And
it felt so like weird. It's like I didn't like them fighting in unison together. It did feel like way too much of like a dance routine.
A choreograph, yeah.
And I was like, I hope this isn't like how the battles progress. Is like everything is like this. Because I think even at the end we realized like, yeah, it does technically work if you choreograph your little fight dance. But it's like it still ends up with like you kind of being a mess at the end of it because you're not really in sync, you're forcing it at that point.
Yeah. No, this is just how they had to deal with the one Angel. So yeah. I like then that Asuka basically calls Shinji and is like chewing him out. And at first she's talking about like, she's blaming him for the mess up, even though it's her Ava laying on top of his, which implies that she was the one that mistimed something and therefore didn't land at the same time as him, but a moment after him and crashed on top of him maybe. And he's like, what are you talking about? You're the one laying on me. And she's like, speaking of which, and she's like, this is like broadcast. So everyone at Nerve is listening to this. And she's like, you tried to kiss me last night. You pervert. You tried to make a move. And like, I think she was half asleep and doesn't really remember it, but she kind of remembers it.
Oh, she remembers it. I think she instigated this whole thing.
I don't know why she's saying mommy then.
I don't know,
Maybe she's trying to play into a very, very confusing role that she thinks Shinji likes or something. Like, I don't know.
Girl's got trauma we have not yet discussed, but like, we've got a pretty good hint that maybe there's been some like sexual stuff in the past. There's something that I'm thinking has gone on that she is hesitant towards, and that's why it's always like anytime a boy makes any
advance or
moves
anything
towards her, which he's the opposite. Like he's not making moves. So maybe that's what's attractive to her is like he's not pursuing her like everybody else is. And even though we are getting hints that like, oh wow, he's actually interested now. Yeah. Which for a minute I was like, hey, maybe he's gay. Maybe like he's interested in boys. Maybe he's just asexual. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. But now we're like, okay, yeah, he likes girls, just this girl right here.
Right. So. I think he's been drawn to Rei at times too, although it hasn't been played as strongly off the sexual stuff. But even when he was touching her boob, he kind of was like he was embarrassed, but I think he was also kind of like, oh, that was kind of awesome, even though it was also humiliating.
You're right. Theirs is just a lot more awkward.
He's a 14-year-old boy, and I think he's trying to figure out, like, I think he's developing that interest, and he doesn't know how to really do anything about it yet. Yeah. We'll see how long that lasts. But, yeah, so she's putting him on blast, and he's like, what? Well, no, but I stopped myself short. And she's like, so you admit it. You did try to kiss me. And like this whole thing is going on, and everyone's just like, oh, this is so embarrassing. I love it because it's such a juvenile, like, bickering between them. Like, their dynamic is really good. And as you pointed out, it brings Shinji even further out of his shell, and you see more of his personality, even if it's in a bickering sense. That you're like, okay, I'm getting a better idea. You're not like a borderline Rei character where you're just a hollow, empty vessel or whatever. Like you've actually got a personality in there, and it's not just all woe is me. Like that's kind of at least
he just had to
thing
open up. It took him a while. He's more reserved, but now we're trying to we're kind of getting to see the other sides of him that we've been missing the first half of the series.
Yep. So then we transition into episode 10, The Magma Diver. This is an interesting episode too. We open up with Asuka going shopping with Kaji, and she is infatuated with Kaji. Like, you can already sense this is going to be a point of contention later when she discovers that Kaji and Misato were and possibly still are a thing.
Kaji's a little creep too. Like the second she was like, "Oh, we're gonna go shopping," and he's like, "Oh, bathing suits," and he gets a big smile on his face, and I was like,
I think
it's 14. You're like 30.
I don't think it's that he's interested in that way. I think it's that he's like bathing suits. Like I think he's like uncomfortable with
smile.
it. Yeah, I think it's supposed to come across. That's one of those places where I think the line read isn't great. Maybe the direction isn't great. I think it's supposed to come across as he's uncomfortable with it because he did not know that that's what they were going for. He was just like, "You said the school trip. Yeah, well, there's going to be diving there, so of course I had to get a bathing suit." And she's like trying to lay it on thick. Like she is obsessed with people seeing her not as a child. That's why I think the first thing she says basically to Misato is like, "Yep, other parts of me have grown as well." I think she's just trying to reinforce like this idea that like I am not a child, which to be fair, when you learn some of the stuff she's done later in the episode, you're like, I could see why you would validly say like you're not like a normal child.
Yeah.
But she's trying to show this off to her, but to Kaji, and she does end up getting it. But that night at the dinner, Misato informs them like, "Yeah, you guys aren't going on the Clash trip. Like you have to be on call." She's pissed off and horrified at this.
And Shinji's just like, "Oh yeah, I kind of figured this was going to happen."
Yeah. And she's mad at Shinji saying he doesn't have balls because he's not pushing back with her. And it's like, we're Ava pilots. Angel attacks could happen anytime. Why did you think we would be able to take a school trip, fly away to another country or whatever on a plane? Of course we weren't going to get to do this. But you still see kind of that child naivety, I guess, where she's wanting and expecting that normal experience, even though, even with what she does, she still didn't connect that this wouldn't be possible. So the interesting thing there is Asuka makes the point of saying like, I'm sick of just waiting all the time. Why can't we take the fight to them, like the angels? And Misato says, yeah, but they never know where they're coming from or when it's going to happen. So Misato says like, believe me, if we could, we would. Funnily enough, that's exactly where this episode is going because Misato and Ritsuko, I think it's like a research station, basically, like someone like mapping the volcanic activity, probably noticed some sort of anomaly in a reading, contacted Nerve. They went and they checked it out and they're like, yep, just before the unmanned probe basically was crushed by the pressure, it did confirm a blue reading, which is the angel. Basically, if it's a code blue or whatever, it's confirming it's an angel.
Yeah, and so that was their blood type too. That's something we address later in the episode, but it said blood type blue.
Yep. So it is an angel down there, and kind of like Adam, it seems to be in some sort of embryonic state. It's almost like it's in an egg or some kind of encasing. And so they come up with the idea that like, okay, we're going to go down there. We've never captured a live angel. We're going to go down there and try and capture this thing. But if we cannot capture it, we're going to have to immobilize it. So real quick on that.
There's going to be another impact too, I think is what
they talk about a second impact.
Yeah, and second impact.
Yeah, and I'll get to that. I realized I was almost skipping over. So when they're trying to figure out who's going to do this, Asuka's like, oh, diving? Yeah, I'll go. I volunteer. Shinji's just muttering to himself like, I'm sure it's going to end up being me again because thus far it always has been. But Ritsuko actually says like, no, it's going to be Unit 2 and Asuka. But then when she's figuring out, I'm still getting ahead of myself slightly. We totally glossed over the second part of that conversation with Misato the night before, where Misato was like, hey, take this as an opportunity to study more because you're flunking your test. And I don't know why you think I wouldn't know that. So when they're at the then swimming pool or whatever, Asuka comes up while Shinji's trying to study science. Of course, she's in the new bathing suit, dripping wet. And again, boobs like right here. And he's like, ah. But she explains the reason she failed the test is because she couldn't read it. She doesn't know the Japanese letter. She can speak it, but she doesn't know how to read it.
Yeah.
And that's where she then points out, yeah, I didn't have to learn any of that when I was in college. And he's like, college? She's like, yeah, I graduated college last year. Like, oh, so maybe it's valid that you think you're smarter and better than the rest of your peers. Because I don't even know why you're in school if that's the case. Like, what's the point? I guess just to give her something to do. But yeah, so she then gives him this basic lesson on...
Which makes even more sense why she's not concerned about her education, too.
Right.
Because we do hear a lot about that, which you could think like, oh, yeah, it's because we have more important things. Well, she's college educated. She doesn't really have anything else to do at this point.
Right. Yeah. And she gives him this lesson on thermal expansion in elementary terms. And I did like, too, like Shinji kind of catches the attention, or he notices Rei on the other side of the pool. She's not even in a revealing swimsuit, but he's kind of like looking at her, and you still get that. It seems like from afar, Asuka may have noticed his attention on Rei and kind of got insecure about it. So she's like, calls out, hey, Shinji, check this out. Backward entry. And it's like not even anything cool or impressive she's doing. Like, that's just another one of those things that like is sort of like a unique, awkward thing of youth. I could totally see. You see that more with like guys, I think, than girls, but I think it's still an interesting thing that like, oh, I think she noticed that Shinji was looking at Rei, misread that as, oh no, he might be interested in her. And so she's like desperately trying to call his attention back.
Yeah, I definitely think that was her showing some interest in his direction. Like,
yep.
Hey, pay attention to me real quick.
Oh, and I think it's totally intentional at this point that she's like showing herself off, flaunting herself a little bit in front of him, not just to draw the reaction, but I think it's because she wants that attention, and she wants someone that will look at her and think like, oh, like you're not a child, like you're fully grown.
Yeah.
And so when volunteering for the mission, Shinji thought like, oh, I'm probably gonna have to do it. But Ritsuko says it's going to be Asuka. But then they're getting geared up in the suit to go. It bloats up hilariously. Like it's this huge, like basically fat suit looking thing. Asuka's horrified, doesn't want to be seen in public like that. They even decked out Unit 2 in like its own bloated suit, exoskeleton suit. And, she's talking with Unit 2 a little bit, and you kind of get this sense like, oh, she talks to this thing like it's a living thing.
Yeah, it's like her friend.
Yeah. But she doesn't want to be seen in public like this. So she's trying to back out of the mission. Like, I refuse to go out and do this. Kaji from like a catwalk up above is like, oh, that's a shame. I was excited to see you in action. So she like, runs away because she doesn't want him of all people seeing her looking like this. And Shinji starts to say like, I guess I could do it then. But Rei puts up her hand and is like, okay, I'll do it. And that pisses Asuka off. She immediately like slaps her hand away and is like,
whatever she has to do to not get you to be the one who gets to do this.
Yeah. And I think she does put like the no offense at the start of it. Like, no offense, girly, but I don't want anything, or I want anything other than you piloting that. I think it's just that she's protective about Unit 2 in general. I don't think she would have let Shinji do it. Because again, as she had that little interaction with Unit 2, seems to imply that like she does have some real connection with Unit 2. She does view Unit 2 as like her thing, and it's like not for anyone else to touch or do anything with.
Well, I think it's partly Unit 2, and then it's probably part the interest she has in Shinji. Like, maybe I want to keep him away from her. I don't want to put her in the limelight as much. If I'm the one doing it, he's still focusing on me.
Yeah. And, Rei, when she tried to volunteer earlier with Unit 0, they make the point that, like, well, Unit 0 is a prototype. It's not, it cannot equip special armor or modifications to do this. So it's just another thing that kind of points out that, like, Rei can be useful, but she's really not, like, in the same tier, at least as far as her Ava, alongside Shinji or Asuka especially. Asuka's is the most combat diverse, I guess you would say. But
yeah, and in this configuration we have now, I think they said high heat, pressure, and then nuclear attacks is what it protects against. But it looks a lot like Big Hero 6.
Yeah.
Like very much in the same vein of that type of look to it.
Yeah. And I think they called it a Type D configuration, and you gave the breakdown of what all that means. So as they're getting ready to drop Asuka or lower her into, because she has a tether, they're going to lower her into the volcano. They're told, like, basically what happens if you fail is that an N2 mine will be detonated, which is what incapacitated the previous angel. But they say, like, given where we are, it'll destroy the angel and all of us. Now, Asuka presumably would still live, but Shinji hearing this is like, who would give such an order? And they're like, oh yeah, it was actually your father.
Yeah, your dad did it.
In the context of that you said earlier, Ritsuko and Misato talking about it, say like, the reason this is so uncharted territory for them is because the last time humanity engaged a dormant angel, the second impact happened. So that's the entire fear of doing all of this. But they think like from a research standpoint and just not having to have a battle with an angel, if they can capture a living angel, that's one less angel to have to deal with. And you could learn so much from it potentially that they're taking this risk.
So with the second impact, and I don't know if we've gotten into this earlier in the show, but do they explain? I mean, I got a little bit like, okay, is it the angel that created this bomb? Is it us dropping the bomb on the angel? Is it a little bit of both? Like what?
They haven't gone into all the detail of it yet, but there's an entire episode later dedicated to what actually happened with the second impact. And even with the little bit of quote unquote declassified information they've given us so far, it's certainly not the entire story. It's the version of the story that is given, internally, but it's not even the truth essentially. So it's like you have those who think they know, but they don't really know.
Yeah.
And even in that group, I would say Misato is among those who thinks they know, but they don't know. So
she definitely seems like she's a little out of the loop. Not terribly, but not quite as much as everybody else is. But I think that also leads to like why we consider her like a good guy essentially. She just
whereas Ritsuko is a little more gray.
Yeah, she's a little bit more like you would probably do anything to get the job done, and like you're gonna pull some things. You're gonna draw some lines that probably are a little over where they should be. But Misato still has some in consideration that like with with this mission alone, it's like this is dangerous. We're way below like normal. Where we're getting to the pressure point that this suit is able to hold, and she just could care less. It's like, hey, let's get this done. The worst thing that happens is this scroll dies, and then we'll get somebody new.
Yep. We did have a quick little scene too where Kaji is talking with a woman. They're on like one of those like rail system things, like basically riding down the mountain, and it kind of gives the sense that like, oh, we know he's done some backroom dealing a little bit with Gendo, but this one seemed to paint a picture of like, I don't think this woman's with Nerve. It seems to imply like a little bit of like an espionage sort of thing, because
I was trying to figure out who this was.
Yeah, I don't know the woman, but I think it's just a contact he has with whoever he's working with. I get the impression
that dog though.
No, I get the impression that he's a spy in this case, and he knows that this is not going to go well, this mission, and she asks like, well, then why are you having them do it? And he's like, because there's no plausible way that I would be able to tell them no without basically jeopardizing like my cover, like compromising myself. Yeah. And so the whole idea is he's letting them go, but he is clearing out, even though he told Asuka like, oh, I wanted to watch you. He's not going to be there, whatever happens. And so that's interesting too, because we did hear Ritsuko say in the episode 7 that internal Nerve information was leaking, and that's how the other agencies knew about things like the AT fields and got some of these photos like of Unit 1 going berserk and things like that. So it seems to heavily imply right now that Kaji might be that leak.
Yeah, it makes sense for his character so far.
Yep. So Ava Unit 2 is lowered in. Again, Asuka, so desperate for attention and seemingly for Shinji in particular, strikes a pose like on the way down, just something kind of dorky. Shinji's just like,
watch.
Yeah, Shinji, watch. Power pose entry. And just lowers into the lava, and Shinji's kind of like, but at the same time, it's just like, she's infatuated with him. There's no way to say it otherwise. She might give him shit. She might say he has no balls and just berate him, but like she is absolutely interested in him. And by the end of this episode, especially so. So they lower her down. You mentioned like the crushing depths. They go like 1,700 meters, like beyond operational thing.
Which I think was at about 1,000 maybe?
Yeah,
or
something
maybe
like
1,200. That's where they originally thought it was, but the suit is not pressure tested for anything beyond that. We start seeing everything kind of fall apart.
Yep, the cracks are happening. Her prog knife falls off and like plunges into the volcano. They do manage to contain the thing, but it almost immediately wakes up and hatches. It even has like a creepy kind of like screaming baby sound as it's hatching. Very unsettling. But the thing hatches and she has to let go of it because this thing developed within a volcano. It's like incredibly resilient to high pressure. It's almost like impenetrable at one point when it's attacking her. Again, she lost her knife. She has no weapon down here. So Shinji has to like throw his prog knife down. And she's trying to...
This is the first time we really see her scared, I would say.
Yeah.
Not that it's intense, but she's like, oh crap, I have no weapon and this thing's coming right for me. Like,
and it's so fast.
I'm going to die.
Yeah. It's swimming through lava like the one in episode 8, the whale thing swam through the water. Like, it should not be this fast. And when she even gets the knife, she's trying to stab the core. She's stabbing the core directly, and it's just doing nothing. And they're like, this thing is so resilient against high pressure because that's the stage it developed in. Then it even opens its mouth and tries to like eat Unit 2, essentially, like envelop it. And they're like, it can open, they're like freaking out. They're like, it can open its mouth in lava? Like, my God, what is this thing's physiology? And it's just like, oh, how are they going to beat it? Oh, wait a minute, callback. Same moment, Shinji and Asuka get the realization of like, I know how to beat it. And they just immediately, what she does is she basically takes like the coolant from her unit.
Yeah, she cuts her cord, right?
Yes, she cuts her cord and shoves this into the angel's mouth and is pumping it full of coolant. They're using the thermal expansion theory they talked about, or not theory, lesson that they learned earlier, or that she taught him rather. And then once it's basically weakened from within, then she's able to stab through the core. But it still looks like she's screwed because without that cord, it's starting, the exoskeleton of Unit 2 is starting to crumble in on itself. Her line back to the surface is breaking away, and she has this moment.
Her top cords too, because I think the first one, if I'm not mistaken, was like maybe on her arm of the Ava. But yeah, this thing goes, swipes across the top, which is about 5 different
cords,
cords or coolant lines, which seem to be lifting her up too. So now she's losing coolant in a crazy amount, and you're seeing the suit kind of crush in on itself. But yeah, another scene where there's like an existential sense of dread from her, where she's like, is this it? Like, this is really how I'm gonna die? Because she's coming to the realization, like, nobody can save me at this point. Like, I am underwater, I'm in this volcano, I'm, this is my last ditch effort, and we already know that like the suit can't handle where I'm at. I go any lower and I'm toast.
And right as she's, I don't even know if it's acceptance. I mean, she realizes that's what's happening, and she's basically just like, oh, this sucks. But she's also like, man, after I came so far. And then right as her line breaks, Shinji in Unit 1, again, not with any protective gear, so I don't know how high they pulled her back to the surface, but you can see like Unit 1 is damaging. It is like kind of also crumbling in just a little bit, but not as bad. But grabs her by the hand, her Unit 2, and she's looking at him with the same kind of twinkle-eyed expression, and you're like, this is peak infatuation with Shinji right now. Like, she is looking at him, and she's doing that kind of like, you dummy, you're testing your luck or something like that, like, because it was reckless. Like, I'm sure they didn't show us because they wanted the dramatic reveal, but I'm sure that Misato and Ritsuko were probably like, the hell are you doing? We have 2 really good Ava units. She's about to be lost forever, and you're risking losing yours as well. So both our pilots and our Avas, because you jumped into the lava that deep. Like, you weren't even equipped to deal with that. It's a little bit dramatic, but it's also like, oh, he's fortunate that worked out, because they could have been screwed if they had lost 2 pilots and 2 Avas just like that, and suddenly had only Rays, which is pretty limited from what we've seen in terms of its modification and all that.
Well, and I'd say that's, that moment too, like where we see her realize that Shinji is saving her. I wrote in my notes, I was like, whoop, she might be in love now, because things seem to shift a lot for her in her respects for Shinji at that point, which, although we've seen him kind of like break off from orders previously, like with the second battle where he comes after it with the knife, even though he was told to stand down. I think at this point we've gotten to the conclusion that like he's a little bit more obedient to orders now. He's really like listening, and this is him going off track again because he realizes that he has to do it in order to save her, which is, I think, his infatuation too.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like what drives the whole, like, my thought of her love for him at this point.
Yeah, for sure. And then we're ending with a scene. They're at the hot springs, which Misato told her they would go to after their successful mission. And it's, again, a very Japanese thing. Shinji's in his own space and they're over on their side. They're like, hey, can you throw us the soap? Shinji was like, sure. Hucks the soap over, apparently hits Asuka somewhere. The closed captioning makes it sound like it hit her on the boob or something like that. Like, I can't believe he hit me there. Then you get a really weird, uncomfortable, I don't even know what to call it. It sounds like Misato's basically groping Asuka.
Yes.
As Asuka is like,
she is telling her not to do something.
Yeah, and they're playing it off like it's a almost endearing sort of thing, and I'm just like, But it's funny because as Shinji's like listening to this, he's kind of blushing, and then you see Pin in the water next to him, basically being the shielding device from what the camera would see essentially. And then even Pin's like, and Shinji like grabs his crotch and ducks down. So like the idea is like, oh, he was getting a little bit turned on hearing all of this going on.
6 to midnight.
Yeah, exactly. And he's just like so embarrassed. He's like just hiding his shame and everything. But the really important thing here in this last scene is we see Misato and Asuka sitting, looking at the sun setting. Misato's just total boobs out. Like you get the view behind her or whatever, so you're not seeing anything. But she's basically just like airing out, as you will. And Asuka notices this huge scar that she has like on her chest, basically. Which reminds me of like if someone's like in a car crash where the seatbelt, how it might kind of cut them, almost that diagonal of like down the not down the sternum, but a kind of across, you know.
I think that's where her capsule came from, like the Avas have.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like a little Men in Black situation, and there's a little alien living inside.
Nice. And so she catches Asuka looking at it, and she's like, "Yeah, I got that from the second impact." And Asuka's line here is really interesting. She's very like solemn and quiet, and she's like, "You know all about me, don't you? About my past." And Misato is just like, "I do." But then she kind of says like, you know, we can't let the past control us. And it's like, it's a really interesting scene where it's like, okay, so there's Asuka alluding to like really heavy shit she's been through, and Misato knows all about it, which kind of makes anytime Misato acts like a bitch to Asuka, like all the worse. Cause it's like, you're saying, you know, exactly what her like vulnerabilities are. And sometimes you are intentionally twisting that knife. Just like I talked about how she'll like sort of weaponize her sexuality towards Shinji, like to try and get him to do what she wants. She'll take a different track with like Asuka, who she can't take that, you know, direction or angle with. So she'll just go like right to cutting to the core sometimes. And it's like, good God, woman, what are you doing?
Yeah, I was curious with that scene. So, I mean, we still don't know Asuka's past, but
you will.
I was like, are you alluding to like the scar, or are you alluding to like your little tickle fight that you just had? It's like something is there, and I'm like, what is it? Because you're trying to figure it out at this point, and I'm like, I don't know what aspect we're talking about here, but something is definitely impacting her life in a pretty severe way that we get to see from all of her interactions with people to this point. We just don't know what that is yet.
Yeah, and we'll get a good look into both of their characters in episodes that follow. I think Misato's is going to be the one that comes up first, and you'll get the story behind the scar and more of a look at the second impact. I think she says in this scene that she was at the second impact, which is kind of her unique link in all of this. But it's two good episodes. I enjoyed the episodes, like you said. They're not for me as high as 7 and 8, but they're a good continuation of that momentum. I'm still very interested in where this is headed, and I'm curious to see as we delve into their characters specifically what their dynamics are going to be and how that's going to relate to kind of painting the picture of who they are and how they interact with other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think we're about spent on time here, so we'll be back next week with episodes 11 and 12. We're making nice movement now, almost halfway through the series. So this is going well. I'm enjoying this. Still very much a thumbs up on this series so far for you?
Yeah, 2 thumbs up.
Very nice.
Good stuff.
Very nice. All right. Well, We'll be back next week, guys. I've been Derek, and for Matt, until next time, peace.
Thanks, guys.